Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we are starting our positional rankings shows for Fantasy Football 2024. Last week, we did the overall rankings 1 through 20 and 21 through 50. This week, we are going to dive in position by position. And today, we are starting off with the most important position in the sport, the quarterback. We are going to go through our quarterback rankings as well as our tiers for quarterbacks and give you some statistics and some advice in drafting these quarterbacks in your season-long fantasy leagues. These rankings and tiers are for season-long fantasy, but if you are playing best ball, you can apply a lot of the logic and a lot of the stats to that as well. And if you want some of our best ball tools as well as our full rankings for the 2024 season for every position, head on over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. The rest of the week, we will be covering the other positions. For running back and wide receiver, we're not going to do full-on rankings and tiers because that would take forever. So we are going to do our annual buy and sell list at each of those positions. Those episodes will probably both come out on the same day. And then tight end will be the last one at the very end. But we hope to have them all done here by the end of the week. And also, while you're here, if you came here for fantasy football, stay for the other sports as well. We recently recorded our college football week 0 preview for daily fantasy. So if you are playing DraftKings or FanDuel for college football, or if you're betting player props or anything like that, check that out as well. And also our weekly golf content is still coming out as well. And we previewed this week's BMW Championship. And if you're subscribed to the channel, you can go ahead and get notifications when all of those drop, including all of the rest of our weekly NFL content. All right, so that's going to do it for the introduction, y'all. If you could for me, please do me a big favor. If you're not already, subscribe to the channel, like the video. If you're listening on audio, rate and review. Helps me out a ton. Let's go ahead and dive into the quarterbacks. All right, so my quarterback one, it should come as no surprise, is Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. He is the one and only quarterback in Tier 1 for me. I would draft him fairly significantly ahead of all other quarterbacks in redraft leagues, and it is because I believe in all likelihood, he's going to end the season as quarterback 1. All the numbers indicate that. All the narratives indicate that. Like, I just think that this guy is, I don't want to say a lock, but it's pretty much in all likelihood, he would be like the heavy betting favorite to finish the season as QB1. And I think he is significantly more likely to do that than anybody else in the NFL. Just look at what he did last year. He beat all other quarterbacks by 40 total fantasy points and averaged 2.3 fantasy points more per game than any other quarterback. So pretty much, if you had Josh Allen on your team last year, you were starting the game 2.3 points ahead of your competition, no matter who they had at quarterback. And also, Josh Allen, unlike a lot of the other quarterbacks that we're going to talk about here tonight, seems to be scheme-proof and supporting cast proof. His offensive coordinator changed from Ken Dorsey to Joe Brady in the middle of last season. The offensive personnel saw some changes with injuries to the tight ends, with injuries to the wide receivers. Didn't matter. He was still the number 1 quarterback in the first half of the season and in the second half of the season. Did not change. He was that dominant. I really think among anybody else on this list, he is the least dependent on his supporting cast. And why is that? Because he is a dual threat. He is going to get you rushing yards as well as passing yards. And believe it or not, I don't think he actually hit his ceiling in the rushing category last year. He rushed for 200 less yards in 2023 than he did in his 2022 season. But the difference is he ran for 8 more touchdowns. So pretty much you got almost the same amount of fantasy points when it was all said and done from the difference in touchdowns versus the difference in yards. And oh, by the way, his passing production did not drop at all in the 2023 season. He averaged the same number of yards per pass attempt in 2022 than he did in 2023. So I really think that Josh Allen is just quite simply just a very likely QB1 finisher. If you look at his stats, not just from last season, but from his entire career, ever since 2020, back when COVID was a thing, back when we were all wearing masks, ever since then, he has averaged 24 fantasy points per game in every single season, each of the last 4 seasons. That level of consistency is unmatched among anybody else at the quarterback position. And oh, by the way, last year, if you draft Josh Allen, you're not sitting him. So you're going to just kind of like take what you get with whatever he scores in terms of fantasy points. And he did not hurt you last week very often. He only had 4 weekly finishes outside the top 10 quarterbacks. So pretty much there was only 4 weeks out of 17 where he wasn't a quarterback that was worthy of being a starter. And oh, by the way, his ceiling was equally as good. He had 4 top 2 weekly finishes. So pretty much 4 weeks, your opponent could not have played a better quarterback than Josh Allen. And that matches the 4 weeks where most starters were better than Josh Allen. I just think he's incredibly consistent. He's got the highest ceiling out of any quarterback, the highest floor out of any quarterback. He is my QB1. I think if you draft Josh Allen, I do not think you have to draft a backup quarterback. He does not have any significant injury history. And let's be honest, he's going to be a guy that you're just going to set him in your lineup and lock him into your lineup. You're not benching Josh Allen. If you draft him, my quarterback 1, my only quarterback in tier 1, Josh Allen. Quarterback tier 2, I should say. These are the guys that QB1 is a possibility, but top 5 is almost a certainty. These 2 guys have a significantly higher floor than anybody else we're going to talk about the rest of the night, obviously, other than Josh Allen that we just talked about for 3 minutes. And these 2 quarterbacks in my tier 2 are Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson. Statistically, they're very, very similar players. And the way they play isn't always exactly similar. Yes, they're both dual threat quarterbacks, but the way they use their legs and their arms could not be further apart. But they statistically shaped up very similar. Both averaged over 21 fantasy points per game last season, so not quite up there with Josh Allen, but they were right there behind him. They were QB2 and QB3 in fantasy points per game. Both have never finished outside the top 7 in fantasy points per game since their rookie seasons. So pretty much since these 2 guys have been full-time starters, they have been top 7 fantasy quarterbacks year in, year out in fantasy points per game. The only thing getting in the way from being top 7 overall would be the 1 year that Lamar Jackson missed some games due to injury. Both were also top 5 in essentially every rushing stat that matters for quarterbacks. I'm talking carries, yards, red zone carries, touchdowns, yards per carry, whatever you want to call it. They were all the stats were really good for both these guys in the way they use their legs. And mobile quarterbacks is a cheat code in fantasy because you get more points per rushing yards than you do for passing yards. Same with touchdowns. So, we really like to target guys like this who have high upside with their legs and with their arm. And really, I think you could make the argument for both of them that they can be as good or better this year than they were last year. Jalen Hurts could absolutely see more passing volume this season. The reason why, Philly got a new offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore, formerly of the Dallas Cowboys and the Los Angeles Chargers. Kellen Moore has generally had a very high volume passing attack, ranks very high in passing attempts year in and year out, utilizes a more up-tempo scheme that is going to get more plays off in less amount of time. So more snaps is going to be more opportunities for Jalen Hurts to get you fantasy points, whether it's passing or running. Lamar Jackson, I think, has a better supporting cast this season. They've never really had a top-end running back in Baltimore since Lamar Jackson has been there. Now they added Derrick Henry. They drafted Devontae Walker, who is a deep threat who can take the top off for this offense. They have both tight ends back, Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely. This is quite simply, this has a chance to be the best Ravens offense since Lamar's been there, and it's another year under Todd Monken's scheme that Lamar Jackson gets, which is a very fantasy-friendly scheme. So like I said, both of these guys have a ceiling of QB1, but they're almost a lot to finish in the top 5 quarterbacks. That is why they stand alone on my tier 2 of quarterbacks, Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson. Quarterback tier 3. These are the last guys who have a genuine QB1 overall ceiling. I genuinely doubt the path that any other quarterback that we're going to talk about tonight has to finishing QB1 overall. Now, obviously, things that we can't predict happen. Outlier seasons happen. But these 2 guys are the last 2 that I would say have a chance to finish as QB1. My quarterback 4 is Patrick Mahomes. My quarterback 5 is Anthony Richardson. So Patrick Mahomes last year was quarterback 10 in fantasy points per game. That was his worst season as a starter. And if you want to boil it down, it's quite simple. The weapons he had last year in Kansas City were the worst that he had had in his career as a starting NFL quarterback. And what did the Kansas City Chiefs go and do? They went out and signed Marquise Brown. They went out and drafted Xavier Worthy, 2 deep threat, speedy wide receivers. And we know what Andy Reid can do with speedy wide receivers. Just remember what he did with Tyreek Hill. So Patrick Mahomes averaged over 20 fantasy points per game every season where Tyreek Hill was a Kansas City Chief. So I think that with Marquise Brown and Xavier Worthy in tow, I think this should be a much more fantasy successful season for Patrick Mahomes. The only concern would be the Chiefs are starting to give me late 2010s Patriots vibes where the regular season kind of doesn't matter. They know they're going to win the 10 or 11 games they need to get into the postseason, and they're really just trying to kick it into high gear for the postseason. So could that mean that they don't really unleash full Patrick Mahomes? Yeah, but everything is pointing towards Patrick Mahomes having a bounce back season this season. So that is why he comes in as my quarterback 4. Every quarterback from here on out is going to have question marks, if we're being honest, y'all. The next one's going to be Anthony Richardson. He's my quarterback 5. And Anthony Richardson only played 4 games in 2023, but he had over 17 fantasy points in every game that he finished. He averaged 1 rushing touchdown per game. Anthony Richardson gives you equal, if not more, rushing upside than Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts. I do not think that he has the same ceiling in terms of passing yards and touchdowns, but the rushing upside is there. And because he is an insane, incredible athlete, and because he is going to give you a lot of rushing fantasy points, that is why he comes in as my quarterback 5. The concern on him would be the fact that he has only played 4 career NFL games. He has to stay healthy. He has to, learn how to read coverages at the NFL level and not just take off and run all the time. But that's good for fantasy when he does that. So Anthony Richardson, not without his concerns, but he is coming in as my quarterback 5 overall, with Shane Steichen, who was formerly Jalen Hurts' offensive coordinator in Philly, calling the shots in Indianapolis. There's certainly going to give plenty of ways for Anthony Richardson to utilize his unique talents, both passing and running, and there's going to be plenty of opportunities for Anthony Richardson to put up some fantasy points. All right, let's take a quick breather, and then we're going to dive into a big one, quarterback tier 4. So my tier 4 quarterbacks is deep. It is 6 quarterbacks deep, in fact. But each one of these guys, I believe, possesses top 5 fantasy quarterback ceiling, and they are an every week starter. I think that if you draft these guys, you can very comfortably set them as the starter in your lineup week in and week out, and you should not feel the need to rush to draft a backup quarterback if you get one of these guys as your starter. And if I'm being honest, this is going to cover you all the way to quarterback 11. So if you're, sitting there thinking at home, well, dang, I have a 10-team league. That means I can get in every game starting quarterback. Yes, absolutely. So this year, I think that this is really a weird year for quarterback, because I think that there is a very large, good tier quarterbacks, which we're seeing here with this tier 4 that I'm about to talk about. There's a lot of quarterbacks that I think you can feel confident about starting every single week, that you have them in their lineup. Regardless of matchup, regardless of situation, you can feel comfortable starting these guys week in and week out. So let's go ahead and talk about it. So my quarterback 6 is CJ Stroud, followed by 7 Joe Burrow, 8 Kyler Murray, 9 Dak Prescott, 10 Jaden Daniels, and 11 Jordan Love. So let's go ahead and discuss, why do I have these guys first off in tier 4 and not tier 3? Well, I do not believe that any of these guys have the ceiling to finish as the quarterback 1 in fantasy. That is the big difference in this tier and the previous 2 that I talked about in Mahomes and Richardson. When you look at guys like Stroud, Burrow, Prescott, and Love, they're giving you virtually no rushing upside. I mean, they're going to give you some rushing yards every now and then, some rushing touchdowns every now and then, but it's not like Hurts or Jackson or Allen or Richardson. And you're just going to be fighting an uphill battle against those guys when those guys are scoring points with their legs and you're dependent on your guy to score points with his arm. What you would need is you would need an exceptionally more efficient passer in terms of being able to score more fantasy points per dropback with his arm, or you would need a system that just throws the ball all over the yard. I'm talking like Texas Tech back in the Mike Leach era, throwing the ball 50 times a game in order to accumulate enough fantasy points to make up for the lack of rushing upside. I hope that makes sense to you listening, but it's simply a math exercise. If one quarterback is scoring a lot of points with their legs, which is a really easy way to score fantasy points, then the quarterbacks who don't have to score more with their arm, and that is a hard proposition unless you increase the efficiency of the passes or the volume of the passes. So anyway, let's go ahead and break down this tier. So CJ Stroud last year was QB7 in fantasy points per game, one of the best rookie seasons we have seen for a fantasy quarterback. More on that later. And there's reason to believe that he could continue to make strides as an NFL quarterback. He's got an offensive coordinator in Bobby Slowick, who is from the Kyle Shanahan tree, which continues to produce elite offensive minds in the NFL. He's got better weapons in adding Stephon Diggs this season. Tank Dell is back healthy. So everything is pointing to CJ Stroud to certainly not regress from where he was last season. And he had some big time ceiling games last season that won some people some weeks, won some people some money in daily fantasy. But CJ Stroud, a lot of big time weeks last year, which ended in a big time season quarterback 7. And I think he is going to be able to repeat that this year. Let's go ahead and talk about Joe Burrow. So Joe Burrow, was quarterback 21 in fantasy points per game last year, but he is due for touchdown regression, and I mean that in a good way. He had an irrationally low number of passing touchdowns last year, and it was because the Bengals offense just didn't have a whole lot of success, and they just randomly weren't good. This is a team that's perennially been a playoff team since they've had Joe Burrow, perennially been a top 10 offense in the league, and they just weren't last year. And I think that they're due for a bounce back. I think that this is a good buy low spot for Joe Burrow. Last year, I looked at my rankings last year. He was my quarterback 4 heading into the season. So I think this is a pretty good buy low spot for Joe Burrow. And I have him just barely ahead of my next guy, Kyler Murray, who was quarterback 6 in fantasy points per game last year. And oh, by the way, they went and added Marvin Harrison Jr. to this Cardinals offense. Trey McBride is going to get another year of experience. James Conner is back for another year. A lot of the personnel from last year returns. The coaching staff from last year returns. So there's no reason to anticipate that Kyler Murray should not be a good fantasy quarterback except for his health. He did miss a few games last year. That has been common with him in his NFL career. If he can stay healthy, he is a set it and forget it every week starter and has top 5 quarterback upside. Dak Prescott last year was quarterback 4 in fantasy points per game. And the weird thing is, which is going to bring me to my next point, every quarterback that we're talking about here in this tier, except for Jaden Daniels, because he's a rookie, had a stretch last season where they were elite for a stretch. CJ Stroud was kind of in the mid to late part of the year. Joe Burrows was kind of like dead in the middle of the time where he was active. Kyler Murray's was later on in the season. Dak Prescott's was later on in the season. Jordan Love's was later on in the season. But Dak Prescott, once the Cowboys offense, well, really, Cowboys as a team, at the start of the season, they were really dominating their opponents, which led to Dak Prescott not having to throw a whole lot. Once their schedule got more difficult, once they started playing actual legitimate NFL teams, then Dak Prescott had to start throwing and throwing and throwing. Their offensive line got worse. Their running game got worse. And so Dak just had to keep throwing and throwing and throwing. And it ended with him being quarterback 4 in fantasy points per game. I do not think he's going to be able to return that result this year, which is why he is coming in at quarterback 9 for me. But I think he is a very safe fantasy starter. I still see him having a lot of passing volume this year. I see that Cowboys offense being very successful again this year. So I definitely think Dak is a solid pick as my quarterback 9. Now, Jordan Love, or I'm going to skip Jaden Daniels for just a second. I'm going to come back to him. Don't worry, Daniels is my quarterback 10. He is ahead of Jordan Love, my quarterback 11. But I'm going to talk about Love. So Love was like elite level last year. In terms of his production in his first year as a starter. And it really got better as the season went on. And so I kind of think that Jordan Love should be able to pick right back up where he left off and continue with leading the successful Packers offense. He's got Matt LaFleur as his play caller who has led Aaron Rodgers to MVP level seasons. The young core of receivers that the Packers have is all aging with Jordan Love. You know, Jaden Reed was a rookie last year. Dontavian Wicks, Christian Watson, they're all young. Romeo Doubs as well. They're all young. They're all kind of maturing with their quarterback. And I think this is a good offense in general to buy stock in. So I think Jordan Love, very reasonable rating at quarterback 11. So Jaden Daniels is my quarterback 10. We're going to talk a second about rookie quarterbacks in general, because some of y'all might have figured out who's going to come next at quarterback 12. But Daniels is my quarterback 10. He is my first ranked rookie quarterback this season. And why is that? Jaden Daniels has a lot of rushing upside. We saw it all the time at LSU. He is an elite level athlete. He runs hard. He will take some hits. He is going to get you every yard that he can fight for, and which is good for us in fantasy because every rushing yard is 0.1 fantasy points. And he also has an elite system for fantasy production. He's coming into an offense with offensive coordinator Cliff Kingsbury. Yes, that Cliff Kingsbury who led Kyler Murray to some of his best fantasy seasons ever. Cliff Kingsbury who had Texas A&M when Johnny Manziel was there, later head coach of Texas Tech when Patrick Mahomes was there. This is an offense that is going to throw air raid principles, which means that they're going to throw quick dropbacks. They're going to play at a fast tempo. They're going to give Jaden Daniels a lot of passing volume, which when you combine with his rushing upside makes him a very viable fantasy starter in my opinion. I think he's kind of the light version of Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson has only played 4 more games than Jaden Daniels. Jaden Daniels was a better college quarterback than Anthony Richardson, and he's coming into an equally fantasy-friendly system in the NFL with Cliff Kingsbury being his offensive coordinator in Washington. So I really do like Jaden Daniels a lot. That is why he comes in as my first-ranked rookie quarterback. Now, the second-ranked rookie quarterback is Caleb Williams of the Chicago Bears. He is my quarterback 12. He is alone in tier 5. I'm referring to him as the rookie wild card. This is a guy who has a ton of upside, but also comes with a little bit of risk. The good news, he is the day one starter for the Chicago Bears. The not so good news is that it's not exactly the most fantasy friendly system in Chicago with Shane Waldron as the offensive coordinator, as opposed to Jaden Daniels coming in with Cliff Kingsbury as the offensive coordinator. But here's the bottom line. It is not uncommon for a rookie quarterback to finish in the top 10 in fantasy football. Starting in 2010, these are the rookies to finish as top 10 quarterbacks in fantasy football: C.J. Stroud, Justin Herbert, Kyler Murray, Dak Prescott, Robert Griffin III, Andrew Luck, and Cam Newton. There is one thing in common that every quarterback there shares, except for Dak Prescott. They were all drafted in the top 10 of the NFL draft. Caleb Williams was drafted with the first overall pick in the NFL draft, like Cam Newton, like Andrew Luck, like Kyler Murray. Generally speaking, elite level quarterback prospects tend to be good fantasy quarterbacks the first year they're in the league. Again, Cam Newton, Andrew Luck, Kyler Murray, C.J. Stroud last year, number 2 overall pick. A lot of people think that he should have gone number 1, and a lot of people still think he should have gone number 1. So Caleb Williams was every bit as good of a prospect as any one of those guys, except for maybe Andrew Luck. But because he was so good as a prospect, and because he also possesses some rushing upside and a lot of arm talent, I think that Caleb Williams, even though he is not in as fantasy-friendly a system as Jaden Daniels, can be a viable fantasy starting quarterback. That is why he comes in as my quarterback 12, slightly behind Jaden Daniels at quarterback 10. He is the only quarterback in tier 5 for me because I think he has an incredibly wide range of outcomes. I think that he can still finish as a top 5 fantasy quarterback. I could also see him getting hurt by week 4 because he's being reckless, or benched by week 4 because he's being reckless. I could see either of those things happening. But, well, maybe not bench. They drafted him with the number 1 overall pick. They're probably not going to bench him. But you guys get what I'm saying, right? Like, the range of outcomes on Caleb Williams is very wide. And so that is why he is sitting here in a tier of his own in tier 5 as my quarterback 12. All right, let's take a quick breather, and then we are going to round out the rest of the quarterbacks that should be draftable this year in fantasy football. Quarterback tier 6 is going to be 3 guys that I view very similarly, my quarterback 13, 14, and 15. These are guys who have a very high weekly ceiling and can be matchup dependent starters in fantasy football. But there are going to be weeks where these guys are all duds. So if you draft one of these guys, I would probably recommend getting one of my quarterbacks ahead of them, in a tier ahead of them to be your starter, or I would recommend having multiple of these guys. Like, I think you could combine for 17 good weeks from these guys if you draft 2 of them. So my quarterback 13 is Brock Purdy. My quarterback 14 is Tua Tagovailoa. My quarterback 15 is Trevor Lawrence. Brock Purdy last year finished as quarterback 6 in fantasy points per game, but he had 5 weeks outside the weekly top 20 quarterbacks. So quarterback 6 at the end of the season, but he was an absolute dud for 5 of those weeks. We cannot have that in fantasy football in terms of being an every week starter. That is why I do not advise drafting these guys to be your every week starter. You either need to get another guy that you can start for some weeks, or let these guys be a matchup dependent backup. Tua Tagovailoa last year, similar scenario. He was quarterback 16 in fantasy points per game, but had 6 weeks outside the weekly top 20. What was equally concerning with Tua was that he was quarterback 3 overall through week 6. He started the season incredibly strong and then faded down the stretch. Some would say it's because the temperatures get lower. I think that's a valid theory because Tua has yet to disprove it. But anyway, the bottom line with Brock Purdy and Tua Tagovailoa is that they play in elite, efficient offenses with the 49ers and the Dolphins. And so the games where those offenses score a lot of points, they're most of the time, more often than not, the quarterbacks score a lot of points. Think about it in basketball terms. If you play fantasy basketball, or if you bet player props in basketball, play daily fantasy in basketball, whatever, when a team in the NBA gets to 120, the point guard probably had a good fantasy night because he was probably racking up a lot of points and rebounds and assists and steals because he was just filling up the stat sheet because the team had to get to 120 somehow, right? It's a similar concept with Purdy and Tua. They are not the engine that makes the offense go, but when the offense goes, they go with it. And so with Purdy and Tua, when their very efficient offenses have very efficient games, usually they come along for the ride. Or there's games like you get what happened with Tua last season where all the touchdowns happen to be rushing touchdowns, and then he's not throwing the ball at all in the second half, and you end up with a fantasy dud of a game where they still scored 40 points. So the bottom line with these two is there are going to be games where they give you incredible results, but you cannot depend on those two to be an every week starter. Trevor Lawrence in his young NFL career, has kind of showed to be the same kind of player as Purdy and Tua, but in a much different way. Lawrence last season was quarterback 13 in fantasy points per game. He only had 2 weeks under 10 fantasy points per game, but he had a 3-week stretch where he scored 25 fantasy points in a row last season from weeks 11 to 13. He's just an inconsistent quarterback. And we have a 3-year sample size on him now to draw that conclusion. And so, like I said, if you draft either of these guys, Purdy, Tua, or Trevor, I think that they can be a starter in any given week, but you need to have a backup plan because there are going to be some duds. And the worst part is, sometimes you don't know when the duds are going to come. And so that is why I much prefer drafting one of the quarterbacks in the tier ahead of them. So that way I can just set it and forget it with that guy as my starter and have these guys as my backup in case of injury or bye week or just a really good matchup. Now, my quarterback 7, these are getting into your backup fantasy players, right? And like I said earlier, if you draft a Josh Allen or a Lamar Jackson or Jalen Hurts, I don't even think you need to rush to draft a backup, if I'm being honest. To me, the best thing that drafting a backup gives you is it gives you trade leverage in case that quarterback ends up being really good, but you don't have to use a roster spot on a backup quarterback if you know that you're going to have one of the weekly top 3 quarterbacks, because I think this is actually a very deep quarterback year. We're going to talk at the very end about some guys that I think are not going to go drafted in standard fantasy leagues, but could be worth a roster spot, could be worth starting on a given week. Anyway, back to my quarterback tier 7. This is the, to quote Lloyd Christmas, Jim Carrey's character in Dumb and Dumber. So you're saying there's a chance. I think there's a chance that all of these guys finish as top 10 or even top 5 fantasy quarterbacks this season, and you can get them at a very low price, but just know that, the pendulum can swing the other way as well. There's a chance that these guys could finish outside the top 20 in fantasy quarterbacks this season. And so I'm going to, give you all for it and make the case for them to finish at their ceiling. So quarterback 16 for me is Justin Herbert, followed by 17 Kirk Cousins, 18 Jared Goff, and 19 Aaron Rodgers. Last season, Justin Herbert, before he got injured, was quarterback 8 in fantasy points per game, and he was over 20 fantasy points in 8 of his first 10 games. He was not giving you duds. The Chargers, more so than any other team this season, had a big overhaul in their organization. New head coach, new offensive coordinator, new personnel all over the place. Some would say that Justin Herbert's weapons got worse. I would make the argument that Justin Herbert's weapons last season were always hurt anyway. And so what you saw is what you're going to get this year. Justin Herbert doesn't need elite weapons to be a good fantasy quarterback. The passing volume with Jim Harbaugh as head coach and Greg Roman as offensive coordinator is sure to go down. But Justin Herbert was pretty efficient as a passer last year as well. So if the efficiency can get higher, even if the volume goes down, he can be a solid fantasy quarterback. We saw Alex Smith and Colin Kaepernick have great fantasy seasons with Jim Harbaugh at the helm as an NFL head coach. Kirk Cousins, very quietly before his injury last season, averaged 19 fantasy points per game. That's it's pretty good. It's pretty good. We don't have enough of a sample size to say what it would have been because he doesn't meet the threshold, but it's a pretty good season for a guy that is now getting an Atlanta offense with another Sean McVay coaching tree disciple, an offense that he's kind of used to running with the Kevin O'Connell system. And he's got great weapons in Kyle Pitts, Drake London, Bijan Robinson. I think that it's a great landing spot for Kirk Cousins. I think he's a solid fantasy option this year. Jared Goff, we have enough of a sample size now about him to know that he is much better in a dome than outdoors. He is very much a house cat, and 14 of his 17 games are in a dome this year. So Jared Goff's production theoretically should go up for no other reason than that alone. Aaron Rodgers is the last one. The last time we saw him play a full season, he was quarterback 21. The season before that, he was quarterback 8. He's got much better weapons in New York this year than he had that last season in Green Bay where there was no Devontae Adams. So this year he has Garrett Wilson to throw to, Malachi Corley, the rookie, Tyler Conklin at tight end, Breece Hall in the backfield. Like, this is a good offense in terms of personnel. And so I think that there's very much a compelling case to be made that Aaron Rodgers can finish as a top 10 quarterback. However, he is quite old. But that never stopped Tom Brady. So I don't mind taking a shot at Aaron Rodgers late in drafts as my quarterback 19. Tier 8, these are the last guys that should probably be drafted in a standard 10 or 12 team fantasy league. They are the high floor fantasy backups: Matthew Stafford, Deshaun Watson, Baker Mayfield. Look, if you feel that you need a backup, but you do not want to draft a guy earlier, these 3 guys are going to be available near the end of drafts. They're solid options. Stafford continues to put up good numbers with the Rams. Deshaun Watson, I refuse to believe that he is just totally bad at football now. I think he's a worthwhile option as a backup. And then Baker Mayfield, who had a very productive season in Tampa last year. You can draft all three of these guys and feel confident that if your quarterback gets hurt or has a bye week, you can plug and play them and feel pretty good. Now, I didn't list them here, but pretty much every quarterback past this, I do not think should be drafted in a standard 10 or 12 team league. I think you can get them off the waiver wire. But of all the quarterbacks that I did not list, the two that intrigue me the most are Will Levis and Bryce Young. Will Levis, because the Titans offense has historically been a run-first scheme under Mike Vrabel. They now have Brian Callahan as their head coach, another guy from the Sean McVay tree. And this is going to be a much more pass-happy offense with solid weapons in DeAndre Hopkins, Cameron Ridley, and Chig Okonkwo, as well as Tyler Boyd. So I think that offense could be pretty good. And Will Levis last year put up fancy points without a whole lot of passing volume. So I think Will Levis is a decent upside play. And Bryce Young, maybe I'm just being optimist Panthers fan here, but Bryce Young was terrifying at Alabama. As a Texas fan, Texas had a 2-point lead on Alabama in the fourth quarter with a minute and a half to go. And I was utterly terrified because I just knew that he was going to make plays and go down the field and score because that's what he did at Alabama, right? Now at Alabama, he had elite level weapons, elite offensive line, elite coaching staff. The conditions were very optimal. Last year with the Carolina Panthers, the conditions were about as far from optimal as they could have been. No receivers that could separate from man coverage, very antiquated coaching staff with Frank Reich, and just not a good situation for Bryce Young. In the offseason, they hired a great offensive coach in Dave Canales, who resurrected Baker Mayfield's career last year. They drafted Xavier Legette in the first round. They signed Deontay Johnson in free agency. They drafted Jatavion Sanders in the fourth round. And they also signed some offensive linemen in free agency. The supporting cast around Bryce Young is significantly better than it was last season. And so I expect the fantasy production to be significantly better than it was last season because I just refuse to think that guy who was such a playmaker and such an athlete, such a gifted quarterback in college is just a total dud as a pro. I think it was a landing spot issue, not a Bryce issue last season. So Will Levis and Bryce Young will be the two guys past tier 8 that I would look at, but I do think you can get them off the waiver wire. If you really believe in them after what I just talked about, then feel free to draft them near the end of drafts, especially if you are in a deeper league. All right, so that is going to do it for the quarterback episode, y'all. Those are my quarterback rankings and tiers. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe. If you're listening on audio, please subscribe. You can subscribe to the audio as well. Please hit the like button on YouTube. Please rate and review if you're listening on audio. Those help me out a ton, guys. I really do appreciate it. If this helped you in any way, like, rate, and review. I really much appreciate it. If you're looking to try out best ball, you heard me talk about best ball, or you checked out some of our best ball content on Underdog, you can use my promo code mconley88 to get your first deposit matched up to $100. So if it's just free money. If you're looking to do some best ball drafts before the season starts, take advantage of that. And then all of my rankings for all positions, as well as all of my best ball tools, are available on the Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. All right, so that is going to do it here for this episode, guys. That was the quarterback episode. Like I said, we are going to be back talking running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends later in the week. So if you're subscribed, you'll know when those drop. You can be here for that, as well as check out all of our other sports content as well. College football and golf are going strong right now. Check those out also. All right, but that's going to do it for this episode, guys. Hopefully I was able to give you guys a lot of information that maybe change your opinion on some of these quarterbacks. If not, definitely gave you some guys to look out for in your upcoming fantasy drafts. Hope I was able to help you guys out. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this point, and I will see you next time.